This is a homily for the 27th Sunday in Ordinary Time. The first reading is from the prophet Habakkuk, chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, and chapter 2, verses 2 to 4. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 17, verses 5 to 10. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. The apostles asked the Lord, "Increase our faith." What exactly are they asking for? And what do we mean by faith? Let's begin by making one thing very clear. The word faith does not mean blind faith, nor does it mean credulity, superstition, naivety, gullibility, or irrationality. Among the many dictionary definitions of faith on offer, we find firm belief in something for which there is no proof. That raises the question, must we have proof before we accept something as true? Barrister Jonathan Gazeman points out that the atheist's essential case that the only truths that we should accept are those for which there is an empirical or scientific basis does not itself have an empirical or scientific basis. The notion that the only things worthy of belief are those which are objectively verifiable is not itself an objectively verifiable belief. The scientific method demands proof. It is characterized by words such as test, touch, see, observe, verify, measure, and examine. The scientific method begins with an empirical observation by asking, why is it so? It then forms an hypothesis, which is tested by experimentation. The scientist then draws a conclusion. But not all truths are amenable to scientific investigation. Many of the truths that we accept on a daily basis are based on evidence rather than proof. For example, whenever I board an aeroplane, I make an implicit act of faith that the plane is airworthy and that the pilot and crew will get me to my destination. I make a similar act of faith whenever I board a bus or catch a taxi. I entrust my life to a medical team whenever I undergo an operation. We make hundreds of acts of faith every day without even being conscious of it. These acts of faith are based upon the experience of a lifetime, but they can't be empirically tested. Unlike a Sudoku puzzle, these puzzles have a correct solution, which can be clearly demonstrated. To work it out, all you need is a logical mind, enough time, and a pencil with an eraser. You can prove that your answer is correct once you're finished by showing that each of the 9 blocks has all the numbers from 1 to 9, with each number appearing only once in each row, column, or box. But life is not a Sudoku puzzle. You cannot offer the same kind of proof to someone when you say, "I love you." The statement, "I love you," which may be true, cannot be empirically verified or scientifically tested. You can't examine a person's DNA to determine whether or not they love you. So let's come back to the question, what is faith? It's a word that we use in a number of different ways. Firstly, we can use the word faith to refer to what I believe. So, for example, we speak of the Christian faith. The beliefs of the Christian faith are expressed in a creed. In November of this year, Pope Leo and Patriarch Bartholomew will meet in Nicaea to celebrate together the 1700th anniversary of the First Ecumenical Council. That council gave us the Nicene Creed. Pope Leo said, "My election has taken place during the year of the 1700th anniversary of the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea. That council represents a milestone in the formulation of the creed shared by all churches and ecclesial communities." However, I think that we can be fairly certain that when the apostles asked Jesus to increase their faith, they weren't asking him to give them a creed that systematically listed everything that he had taught them so far. Faith, more often than not, is wrestling with the question rather than sitting smugly with the correct answer. A pious young Jew who had devoted his life to studying the sacred texts of his religious tradition suddenly closed the copy of the Talmud that he'd been reading and, without any apparent reason, ran out of the yeshiva where he'd been studying right into the middle of the town square, crying out, "What is the meaning of life? I cannot study one additional verse of Torah without knowing the meaning of life." Some fellow students ran to his aid and tried to calm him down, but to no avail. They could not convince him to return to his studies. So they recommended that he visit a learned and saintly rabbi who lived in a nearby village. The pious young lad set out immediately to visit the rabbi, and no sooner had he entered his house than he whispered nervously, "Rabbi, what is the meaning of life? I must know. I cannot go on any longer." The rabbi walked over to the young man, looked into his eyes, and suddenly slapped him. "Why, Rabbi? Why did you slap me? What have I done? All I did was ask, what is the meaning of life?" The rabbi replied, "You fool! You have such a good question. Why exchange it for an answer?" The year before he died, the Cistercian monk Thomas Merton had this to say: "Can I tell you that I have found answers to the questions that torment the people of our time? I do not know if I have found answers. When I first became a monk, yes, I was surer of answers. But as I grow old in the monastic life and advance further into solitude, I become aware that I have only begun to seek the questions." So, faith refers to what I believe, but secondly, faith also refers to a way of seeing, a way of looking at life. Let me use an analogy to explain what I mean by a way of seeing. The magnificent Cathedral of Chartres is located to the southwest of Paris. Its official name is the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Assumption, and it was built in its current Romanesque and Gothic form between 1190 and 1220. Here you can see the southern porch of the cathedral. I'd like to direct your attention to the rose window which is at the centre of this photograph. It dates from about 1220 AD. When you look at the stained glass rose window and the 5 windows beneath it from outside the cathedral, it is virtually impossible to appreciate their beauty. Standing outside the cathedral, the rose windows appear colourless and opaque. However, all of that changes once you enter the cathedral and view the same windows. From inside, they appear as a festival of colour and light, of warmth and brightness. It is now possible to see the story that they tell in each pane of stained glass. When we stood outside the cathedral, we saw the same windows, but their beauty was hidden. From inside the cathedral, we see these very same windows, but quite differently. Now we see them brought to life by the light of the sun. This might be a helpful analogy when we consider faith as a way of seeing. The disciple of Jesus is not cocooned or inoculated from all the absurdities of life, from suffering and death, but our faith gives us a way of seeing. From inside the household of faith, we view life differently, just as we entered the cathedral and saw the windows transformed by the light of the sun. As believers, we are enlightened by the Son of God. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." The Anglo-Irish theologian and scientist Alistair McGrath put it this way: "What drew me to faith initially was this very deep sense that it made much more sense of the world and my experience than anything else. Certainly much more sense than atheism. Faith makes sense in itself, but it makes sense of everything else as well." Faith refers to what we believe. It is also a way of seeing. But thirdly, we can describe faith as a journey. I've been pointing out that the longest section of Luke's Gospel is his lengthy account of Jesus and his disciples making their way to Jerusalem for the celebration of Passover. The journey began at chapter 9, verse 51, and it takes us up to chapter 19, verse 27. The Sunday lectionary in Year C devotes 19 weeks to what Jesus does and says on this journey. But as I've been pointing out, this is more than a journey from Galilee in the north to Jerusalem in the south. It is also an inner journey. Jesus takes the opportunity to teach his disciples about life in the kingdom of God. Luke depicts Jesus' whole career as a course or a way. The Greek word for way is hodos. Luke characterizes the whole of Jesus' ministry using that word. In Acts chapter 13, verse 24, Paul uses the word exodos to describe Jesus' coming or entrance. That word is a compound of eis, which means into, and hodos, which means way. When Jesus converses with Moses and Elijah in the transfiguration scene, we're told that they were speaking of his departure, or exodos in the Greek. That word is a compound of ex, which means out, and hodos, meaning way. Hence, his coming is exodos, and his death is exodos, the way in and the way out. In the Acts of the Apostles, disciples of Jesus are referred to as members of the way. And once again, way is a translation of hodos. The first encyclical letter that Pope Francis wrote was called in Latin Lumen Fidei, or the Light of Faith in English. The central idea of the encyclical lies in the word journey. The Latin words via and iter are used almost 90 times in the encyclical. Those words mean something like way, highway, road, path, or journey. The idea of faith as a journey seems to have been quite dear to Pope Francis. The final synod of his pontificate was the Synod on Synodality. The word synod comes from the Greek sun, meaning with, and hodos, which means way, journey, or road. So etymologically, synod means to journey with. Hence the model of church as synod is that of disciples on a journey together. And like all journeys, it has its ups and downs. What is true of most journeys that we undertake is also true of the journey of faith. There are obstacles, setbacks, confusion, wrong turns, misunderstanding, and getting lost. Journeys take time. We need directions. The outward journey often leads to an inner journey of discovery, and journeys have a destination. Finally, faith means trust. The Greek noun for faith is pistis. In the New Testament, the noun pistis often refers to trust and confidence in the power manifest in Jesus. So, for example, the power to heal. The word first occurs in Luke when Jesus notices the faith of those who brought to him a paralytic, lowered down through the roof. It is also clear that there are different degrees of faith. At Capernaum, Jesus comments on a centurion's faith. I tell you, not even in Israel have I found faith as great as this. The noun pistis carries the nuance of a personal commitment to Jesus, a commitment that can grow or diminish. During the storm at sea, Jesus challenged the disciples, "Where is your faith?" The disciples' request in today's gospel recognizes that faith is a dynamic process and one can grow in faith. When the disciples ask that the Lord add to or strengthen their faith, they recognize that faith is not just a matter of their own strength. Faith, pistis, is always a gift from God and never something that is achieved through human effort. The late Father John Kavanagh, formerly Professor of Philosophy at St. Louis University in the United States, tells us about a time that he met Mother Teresa. During a visit to Kolkata, he had celebrated Mass at the Missionaries of Charity Mother House and worked at the House of the Dying. Shortly before he left Kolkata, he asked Mother Teresa to pray for him. Mother Teresa asked, "For what?" He replied, "For clarity." She immediately said no, she would not pray for that. Father Kavanagh complained that she always seemed to have clarity and certitude. She replied, "I've never had clarity and certitude. I only have trust. I'll pray that you trust." Perhaps at some time or another you've participated in a fairly basic trust exercise, like those that you can see here. Participants are invited to let themselves fall backwards, trusting that someone is standing behind them ready to catch them. That's not a bad image of pistis, allowing ourselves to fall into the hands of God. Jesus tells the disciples that if their faith were the size of a mustard seed, they could say to a mulberry tree, "Be uprooted and planted in the sea," and it would obey you. Let's reflect for a moment on the image of the mustard seed. It's not the smallest seed on earth. Orchid seeds and cypress seeds are smaller than mustard seeds. Nevertheless, the mustard seed is very small, and the tiny size of the seed was a familiar metaphor among the Jews. Jesus is not saying that the disciples don't have any faith. Rather, he is telling them that if they have even the tiniest amount of faith, they could command a mulberry tree, a large tree that grows higher than 18 metres and has a deep and extensive root system, to be uprooted and planted in the sea. New Testament scholar Alan Culpeper offers this reflection. The point is not that the disciples need more faith. Rather, they need to understand that faith enables God to work in a person's life in ways that defy ordinary human experience. The saying is not about being able to do miraculous works or spectacular tricks. On the contrary, Jesus assures the disciples that with even a little faith, they can live by his teachings on discipleship. Tom Wright adds this: "It is not great faith you need, it is faith in a great God." Faith is like a window through which you can see something. What matters is not whether the window is 6 inches or 6 feet high. What matters is the God that your faith is looking out on. If it's the Creator God, the God active in Jesus and the Spirit, then the tiniest peephole of a window will give you access to power like you never dreamed of. Disturbing the Dust, Notes from the Margins, is the title of Father Tony Herbert's reflections on 50 years as a missionary in India. In 1965, 5 years after joining the Australian Jesuits, Tony was sent to the Orders mission in Hazaribagh. It was to be a lifelong transfer because at that time Jesuit missionaries did not return home. Tony writes about his ministry among the Dalits, formerly known as untouchables. They were at the very bottom of India's highly stratified society. Tony offered this reflection on the plight of the Dalits. The tragedy is, though, that not only does such a feudal society force the Dalits to remain that way, but they have been convinced that this is the way it should be. They have been brainwashed into accepting their inferiority. There were various mechanisms that enforced this ideology: verbal abuse, social isolation, and threats of or actual violence. The Dalits had learnt from birth that this was simply the way the world was, and any other alternative was beyond possibility. This left Tony with feelings of helplessness and of being unable to do anything. Despite the seemingly hopeless situation, the Jesuits began by starting a small, non-formal school in a place called Babupara, but it was difficult to convince the Dalits to attend. When I started in Babupara, I said, "Let's start a small, non-formal school here." They said, "We don't go to school. Those people, high caste people, they go to school. You start a school for them. We don't go to school." So that was a challenge also, but Tony persisted. Now from that one village, we've got over 100 boys and girls who have gone to tertiary education. Who knows what will emerge from those small beginnings? When we begin what appears from a human perspective to be a seemingly impossible task, we need to keep today's gospel in mind. So, when the disciples request more faith, Jesus responds with a qualitative image of faith, that of the mustard seed. The disciples are interested in quantity. Jesus is concerned about quality. Jesus assures us that very little faith is needed to accomplish extraordinary things. John Bergsma tells us that our Lord's words are meant to be an encouragement. You may have only a tiny amount of faith, but go ahead and step out on that faith anyway. You do not need huge faith already in order to begin serving the Lord. He will take what you have and do great things with it. Earlier in the Gospel in chapter 5, Jesus urges Peter to put out into the deep, duc in altum. Jesus summons us to leave behind our fears and anxieties, to leave behind seemingly insurmountable obstacles and, in faith, launch out into the deep. Today's first reading teaches another important aspect of faith. Faith is a waiting on God. Writing in the 7th century BC, the prophet Habakkuk wrestles with the perennial problem of maintaining faith in a God of justice in the midst of rampant injustice. Today's first reading consists of 2 parts. The first part is the prophet's direct address to God. How long, O Lord, am I to cry for help while you will not listen, to cry violence to you, though you will not save? Why do you show me wrongdoing, make me see evil? Plundering and violence confront me, contention and discord flourish. Habakkuk confronts God's seeming lack of compassion. God seems passive and indifferent. It would appear that God has turned a deaf ear to his anguish. Where, he is asking, is God's tender solicitude for his people in the midst of violence, plundering, and injustice? In the second part of today's first reading, God does respond, not with an answer, but with a vision that the prophet is instructed to write on tablets. We are told that its fulfillment is in the future. God says, although it may take some time, wait for it, for come it certainly will and will not delay. In other words, the exact time of disclosure is known only to God. And contrary to what appearances might suggest, God is indeed in charge of the events of life. Habakkuk and everyone else with him will just have to wait patiently until the appointed time arrives. The righteous person waits in faith. There is yet another lesson to be learnt from today's gospel. Nothing that we do ever puts God in our debt. Jesus asks his disciples a question. Must a master be grateful to his servant for doing what he was told? And the lesson? So with you. When you have done all you have been told to do, say, we are merely servants. We have done no more than our duty. In other words, God owes us nothing for living good Christian lives. God's favour and blessing are matters of grace. They cannot be earned. Grace, by definition, is a free gift. We are also reminded that we are not the centre of the universe. we must cede control to our heavenly Master, in whose bondage we find our freedom. Tom Wright reminds us, the shocking lesson that all we do, even the hard work we do for God, never for a moment puts God in our debt. How often do we hear it said, and how many more times is it thought, I've done all this, I've given all that money, I've worked so hard, surely God will be satisfied with that. The answer is that all genuine service to God is done from gratitude, not to earn anything at all. Saying we are not worth anything at all doesn't mean that we lack a proper sense of self-worth and self-love. It just means that we must constantly remind ourselves of the great truth: we can never put God in our debt. Saint Pier Giorgio Frassati was canonized on September the 7th this year. In 1925 he scribbled the words verso alto on the back of a photograph taken during one of his mountain climbs. That Italian phrase translates into English as toward the top, but the phrase has become emblematic of his aspirations. Like the command of Jesus to Peter, put out into the deep, verso alto encapsulates the same idea of launching out in faith into the unknown. St. Pierre asked himself this question: will I have the strength to persevere all the way? And his own response to this question was, by yourself you will accomplish nothing. But if you place God at the centre of all your actions, then you will reach the goal.